My name is Miranda Oakley and I'm a certified rock climbing guide for the AMGA. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the basics of traditional climbing. Alright, so here I've got my standard trad climbing rack, including passive protection, which are nuts, and active protection, which are cams. As you can see, I've got a whole variety of different sized cams. I've also got a variety of different shaped cams, and those different sizes and different shapes of cams help me find the correct protection to put in a variety of different shaped cracks.
Nuts are passive protection. They work as human-made chalk stones that wedge themselves into the constrictions of the crack. They're directional, meaning that if you pull them in one direction or down, they wedge themselves even farther into the crack and become an even stronger placement when placed correctly. But when you pull them up, um, they become loose or can even come out. The more surface area of your nut that's touching the inside of the crack, the stronger your nut will be. So when you're placing a nut, you want to make sure that you have a good constriction and the sides of the nut are flush with the sides of the inside of the crack.
So as you can see here, I have two cams that are about the same size. They would fit the same size crack, but they're different shapes. As you can see, this black Metolius has a much narrower head right here than this red black diamond cam, or this number 1 black diamond cam. And what that's great for is just different sizes or shapes of cracks. So sometimes you might get like a pin scar or kind of a hole in the rock where these kind of wider headed cams won't fit in as well, and these narrower heads fit much better. Or you might have a parallel sided crack where these black diamond cams are super bomber. Cams are active protection. They have a few different parts. Here we have the sling, and that's what you connect to the rope. And then this long rod here, or this cable, is called the stem, and that stem connects kind of where your thumb goes and goes all the way to the head of the cam. And the head of the cam is right here. That's made up of 4 different lobes, sometimes 3. And those lobes connect to a trigger with a trigger wire to the trigger. And the way they work is you push with your thumb at the base of the cam and you pull with your 2 fingers on either side of the trigger. When you pull the trigger in, the lobes get smaller, and when you release the trigger, the lobes expand. So when I'm placing these in the crack, what I do is I pull the trigger and I pull those lobes all the way down, and I put it inside the crack and release the trigger. And as I release the trigger, the lobes expand inside of the crack. So the more I pull on this cam, the more those lobes are going to push against the side of the crack, making a really strong piece of protection. In fact, it's going to be almost impossible for me to remove this cam, or maybe even impossible for me to remove this cam just by pulling on it, which it makes it a great piece of protection, great for catching the fall. But then when it's time to take the cam out, all I have to do is put my thumb back on the bottom of the cam and my fingers back on the trigger wire, and pull in on that trigger wire, making those lobes smaller, and slide it out of the crack. So the first thing you look for when you're placing cams in the rock is the quality of the rock itself. And rock quality is something you should sort of start looking at before you get to trad climbing. You should be looking at your rock quality whether you're bouldering, sport climbing, or even walking over a talus slope. And you just want to, when you're looking at rock quality, you want to make sure that everything is connected well. You don't have a cam that you're trying to stick behind a death flake or a giant block. that could come teetering down. And one really good way, a really simple test of the rock quality is just by knocking on it. If it hurts your knuckles to knock on it too much, you can always use a carabiner. And you want to listen to the sound. So as you can tell, this rock is pretty good because it's kind of like, doesn't have much of a sound to it at all. But you can hear the difference on this one. It's got sort of a more hollow sound. It sounds a little bit more like a bongo drum. And when you hear something like that, or if you notice the rock has a hollow sound to it, doesn't necessarily mean never place a cam there, but maybe you should stop and evaluate and make sure it's not something that's going to come off the rock. Alright, so the next thing you have to look for when you're trying to decide what cam to place is the size. I usually associate a crack size with my hand size and with a cam size. So if the crack is a little bit too big for a comfortable hand jam, I know that this blue Metolius will fit really well, this bigger blue Metolius. But if it's kind of a tighter hand jam, maybe it's better for, a red black diamond cam. And if I can just get my fingers in the crack, I'll go for one of these smaller sizes of cams. Alright, so when you're placing these cams, you want to make sure you're looking at the lobes and how they fit into the crack. So you don't want the cam to be too over-cammed or too under-cammed. So over-cammed means that the lobes are pulled all the way in and you're squeezing it into a crack that it's probably too big for. So you should really just find a smaller cam if the lobes are looking like that to get it into the crack. And the problem with over-camming your gear is that it's really hard for the person cleaning the cam to get it out. And the problem with it being under-cammed is that you have less surface area of the cam lobes touching the crack, and the cam will be more likely to move around in the crack and possibly opening up all the way and becoming an unsafe piece of gear. The next thing you have to look for when you're placing a cam is the orientation. So when you place your cam, you want it to be oriented correctly, which means you want the cam to be directional. And when I say directional, that means that the cam is kind of already placed in the direction it were to go in if you were to fall on it. So if I were to place this cam, climb up above it, and take a whip, I would fall onto the cam, and the way I've placed it here, it won't move at all. Versus if I were to place the cam kind of flagged, perpendicular to the crack, if I were to fall on it, the cam would move inside the crack, and that could make the cam fall out of the crack. It's not going to here because the placement is so good, but if it's not as bomber of a placement, that movement of the cam inside of the crack could make it come out. So you want to make sure that the cams are in the direction of pull or in the direction of force if you were to fall. The next thing you have to look at when you're placing a cam is surface area. So you want the most amount of surface area of your cam lobes touching the rock. That's a pretty simple one. When you place it, you want to look inside and make sure that your cam lobe isn't balanced on a little crystal inside of the crack or any sort of like uneven texture on the rock. And you want to make sure that the cam lobes are touching as much of the crack as they can. And for that reason, this blue Metolius cam, because it's a bit bigger, it's going to have more surface area touching the rock than one of these smaller cams. The lobes are so much smaller, they won't have as much surface area touching the rock as one of these bigger cams. So that's something that's important to think about while you're placing gear, that this tiny little cam, even when placed properly, might not be quite as strong as one of these bigger cams because it's just got more surface area touching the rock. Alright, so now that you know how to place your cams, you can start working on building trad anchors. So when you're building your trad anchor, I like to use an acronym called B-RENAE. So the first B stands for big picture, and we already talked about a big part of the big picture, which is rock quality and how to identify bad rock. The other thing you want to look out for when you're thinking of where to place your anchor are things like whether or not the anchor is over the rock climb, so that when your second is following or climbing the pitch, they're not faced with a huge swing if they were to fall. You also might want to think about having a little ledge underneath you and being able to belay from a comfortable stance. You also could think about people climbing above you. And so just sort of common sense stuff is included in big picture. The next thing you want to think about is your protection. So the first E stands for excellent excellent protection. So like all the things we just talked about with our cams and with our nuts, we want to make sure that we've got all of that going on with the cams that we place in our anchor. When we're using our anchor, this is all we've got to rely on. You know, when we're placing cams on lead, we place one cam, then we place another cam, and then we place another cam. So one of the cams, if we placed a bad cam at some point, you know, that's going to be quickly backed up with another cam. But with our anchor, you know, that's pretty much relying on, or your second is relying on the anchor itself, and so it has to be super bomber. All the gear has to be really good. So here I've got 3 bomber pieces of pro, and that brings me to the next letter in the acronym of B Renee, which is R, and R stands for redundancy. And we would never want to build our anchor off of one cam, even though these cams can hold like 1,000 pounds if they're placed correctly and they're super strong. They're more than strong enough to hold both, you know, me and my climbing partner on the wall, but we want to back it up with at least 1, if not 2 other cams. So that's up to 3 pieces of protection. And if you're not into some of your pieces of pro, you could add a 4th piece, or if you have, you know, if you have some like tiny pieces of pro that you've placed in your anchor, you can always add a 4th or even 5th piece of protection if you feel like it's necessary. So the next E in the acronym stands for equalization. So I've got 3 cams in the crack. It's super redundant, but if I were to clip my climbing rope into all 3 cams and belay my partner up, the problem with that is all the weight that I'm using or putting on the anchor is only going into 1 cam. So it's only pulling on 1 cam, and if that cam were to fail, we would then shock load the other pieces of gear. So we want to somehow make it so that we're pulling on all 3 pieces of this gear equally. And the best way to do that, if you're starting out, is just to buy a cordelette. So what I use is like a 5 mil or 6 mil cordelette, and it's about 15 or 16 feet long. And I usually have it tied in the middle with either a couple of overhand knots or double fisherman's, or you could also use your figure 8 and your figure 8 follow through to tie this giant cordelette into a loop. So you take your cordelette here, unravel it, and you're going to clip it into all 3 pieces of this gear. Alright, and first thing I'm going to do is kind of slide the cordelette through so that this knot is sort of next to one of the carabiners on the piece of gear. What that does is gets the knot out of the knot that I'm going to tie, out of the way of the knot that I'm going to tie in a little bit here. So I've clipped it through all 3 pieces of gear, and I'm going to take a piece of cordelette from in between each piece of gear here, and I'm just going to pull it down. And as you can see, I've sort of made like a giant W. And I'm going to shift this knot around so it's not on the cam, but it's just close to it. And I'm going to take both of the bottom parts of my W, and I'm going to combine them and kind of grab them with one hand. So now, just like this, I'm pulling equally on all 3 pieces of this cam. But you know, I don't want to just, you know, take this and clip my climbing rope through that. Right? It's equalized, but if any of these pieces of gear were to fail, it's going to kind of pull through here and extend, and it could shock load the other pieces of gear. So instead of just clipping my climbing rope through like that, before I clip anything to this cordelette, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull down in the direction that the climber is coming up from. So in this scenario, we're pretending like the climber is just coming from down there, right below us. So I'm going to pull in the direction that the climber is coming up from, I'm going to slide my hand up the cordelet, grab all of those cordelets with your hand, and tie a little knot here. And this knot, it can be a simple overhand knot, just like that, if you don't have a lot of extra cordelet. Or you can tie, you know, your standard figure 8 knot here, right? And you want to try to shoot for this master point being about chest level, and that'll make it much easier to belay your second as they come up the pitch if you're going to belay from the top. So I'm going to leave that right about there, and then I'll either clip myself into the anchor, or if I'm building like a top rope anchor, I would have 2 locking carabiners going through this, opposite end of post. Alright, so now once you've got your anchor all set up, you're gonna, if you're on a multi-pitch climb, you're gonna want to clip yourself and make yourself safe. So clip yourself into the anchor, so that you can call down to your partner and let them know that you're off belay. So the way I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna take the same climbing rope that I'm using to climb up the pitch with, and I'm going to clip it into the master point using either a clove hitch, or if you want, you can also use a figure 8 on a bite. I prefer the clove hitch because it's an adjustable hitch and it's super strong. The way I do that is I'm going to first clip a free locking carabiner into the master point here, and then I'm going to take my climbing rope. I'm going to make 2 bear ears, and one bear ear is flipped one way and the other bear ear is flipped the other way. And then I'm going to cross them, so I'm not going to just go like this. I'm going to cross the 2 bear ears, and I'm going to clip them into the anchor. And then I have to make sure that my carabiner is locked. And the last step is you want to tighten up your clove hitch and make sure it looks like that. So now that you've got yourself clipped into the anchor, you're safe and you can yell down to your climbing partner that you're off belay. Once you're off belay, you can pull up the remainder of the rope. If your climbing partner is down there on the ground, they should be already tied in with their figure 8 and figure 8 follow through. And that's something you want to check before you leave the ground. So before I leave the ground on any multi-pitch climb, or any climb for that matter, I check both my knot, and if it's a multi-pitch, I'm going to check my partner's knot as well. So everyone's tied in at the base of the climb, so that when you pull up all the rope, it's going to stop when it gets to your partner. If your partner's not tied in, you could pull up the entire rope, including the end of it, which they're going to need to get belayed up. So once you've pulled up enough rope, you're going to try to keep your coils kind of neat, and I like to stack my coils over my rope that I've used to clip into my anchor. So I'm going to pull up the rope until I can't pull up anymore, because then I'm pulling on my partner. Once I've pulled up all the rope, I'm going to take my ATC guide or my Petzl reverso or whatever you've got, and I'm going to clip it into the anchor. So as you can see, this device is not just your standard belay plate. It's got the 2 holes here that you thread the rope through, but it's got an extra hole on top, and that's the hole we're going to use to clip into the anchor. And you can only do this with these special devices, either Petzl reverso or ATC guide. Each company has their own version of this device, but they all have some sort of hole or connection point on top of the device. If you have a standard belay plate without this hole, you cannot use this method to belay up a second. So you have to have this hole here to connect it to the anchor. So I'm going to go ahead and connect it here to the anchor and make sure that carabiner is locked, obviously. And I'm going to take my climbing rope, and I'm going to take a bite of the climbing rope and feed it in to the device, just like I would if I were to belay a top rope belay, a standard top rope belay. So when I feed it through, I'm making sure that the rope that is going down into the climber is going into the top of the device, and the rope that my brake hand will be on is going into the top of the bottom of the device. So it's going to be like a sideways U looking thing like that. The climber on this end, brake hand on this end. I'm going to feed it into the device. A lot of these devices have a very small little diagram on the device to show you which end should go in which side. So once I've got that through to my device here, I'm going to clip it in with my carabiner and make sure that's locked as well. To test the device, I'm going to pull through on my brake strand, and if I can pull through anything at all on my brake strand, even though with these fatter ropes it can be quite difficult to pull the rope through. But if I pull on the end that the climber is on, it should automatically lock. So if you pull it one way, the rope goes through. If you pull it the other way, it locks up. Alright, so if you don't have the special HEC guide or the pencil reverso and you're just dealing with a standard belay plate without one of these extra holes in it, that's okay. You can still belay from the top on a multi-pitch, but you have to do it off of your harness instead of off of the anchor. And that can be in a couple different ways. You can either just clip into your belay loop, add a directional to the anchor. So you want to find something a little bit above maybe your master point, like the shelf of the anchor. And the shelf is like, if I take one strand from each piece of gear, so essentially I'm clipping into all three of these loops coming from the gear. I can kind of use that as a directional for my climbing partner and set up a standard kind of belay from here. And while belaying, you know, that's kind of going to look like, that's going to be the closest thing to your standard top rope belay, where I'm just going to kind of belay normally with that as a directional. You just got to be really careful. You've got enough room here so if your climber falls, you don't have your ATC get sucked up into that directional carabiner. So thanks for watching my video. I hope you learned a lot. If you are looking for a guide or want to join some of my classes, you can always check out my website or follow me on Instagram.